If you want to aim your life and influence toward the glory of God, Thann Bennett will share how from his book, My Fame, His Fame. God told the Israelites to do something pretty unique when they crossed into the promised land. That's good for us too. And what one dad did during the aftermath of Hurricane Helene to make sure he didn't miss his daughter's wedding is hiking him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up in episode 95 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast, Thann Bennett. His book is called My Fame, His Fame. I really was feeling you. I was like, this is how I feel, because you talk about how you don't think you really want to be famous, and that's kind of how I am too, even though I'm in radio. That's not the goal for me. But you say that we were created for fame.
Honestly, Andy, I love that was your reaction, because that was kind of the design with the title. I wanted people to kind of maybe even cringe a little at the idea of, we're going to pursue my fame, or this idea of fame, because I wanted it to sort of set the hook. Because Andy, I think we have an obsession with fame in our culture, and I think it's a two-edged sword for those of us who are following Jesus, because the temptation is to look at the pursuit of fame that we see around us in our world, right, and reject it and run away from it. And while that is good in one sense, Andy, I think Scripture pretty clearly tells us that we actually were created for fame. Now, we've got to learn a different definition of fame, because it's not the one that comes to mind for you and for me. It's not platforms and likes and visibility. It's the fame that God talked about when He said He was going to make Abraham into a great nation, or He was going to spread Joshua's fame throughout the land, or the story that I anchor the book in is actually about Habakkuk, but it's about being vessels that are capable of acquiring the fame of God and then taking that fame to meet a tangible world. And so, just to sort of set it in a hook of Scripture, I think my favorite verse that illustrates this point is Isaiah 43:21, which God says to Isaiah, He says, "The people I formed for who? For myself, that they may proclaim my praise." So, Andy, I just have to be careful that while I'm trying to live a life that isn't centered on me, as hard as that may be, that I don't throw out the idea altogether that there are messages that I'm supposed to proclaim to the world. It's His messages, it's His fame, but He's intentionally put those messages inside you and me. They don't often meet a tangible world on their own. We've got to carry them to the world.
Yeah, and I think that ties in, as you just talked about a little later on in talking about fame. Where am I known? Such a deep question, relating to the whole fame thing too.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, I think when we pursue a breadth of personal fame, it's destructive, right? It's what Madonna talked about when she said that she's not going to be satisfied until she's famous like God. This is one of the most famous people on the planet who is not going to be satisfied until her fame rivals that of God. But, being known by the famous one, being known by the Creator, Andy, is what gives us power. So, there's a depth of being known by Him that will sustain, while pursuing the fame that we see around us will destroy us. But I'm just so taken with this idea that God has specifically designed the glory of His name and the elevation of His fame to be entangled with the pinnacle of His creation, us. I mean, I really believe, Andy, that He could have done this another way, right? He could have brought glory to His name without involving us, but He so desires relationship with us that I think sometimes His seemingly absence from our world or from certain situations is actually because He's waiting on us to come to Him and interact with Him and be entangled with that story. So, look, I'm fervently believing that we're on the edge of a mighty move of God. But it's not on autopilot, Andy. It depends on you and me deciding that we want to be a part of this and sort of following in the footsteps of Habakkuk and calling for God's fame to be repeated, and then saying, look, we're willing to be the ones that facilitate that, and that you move through us.
Tying into that too, and I thought, again, I feel you on this one, Thann, that you say we're encouraged to pursue the wrong kind of leadership. And I often think there's this disconnect sometimes, especially in the Christian world, There's the Global Leadership Summit. Not that they're saying there's anything wrong with that, but there's all these ideas of we need to be leaders, we need to be leaders. And then there's other people that will say, well, but Jesus says we're supposed to follow him. And so that we're in this world of what does leadership look like? Biblical leadership look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, I'd start that chapter off by saying I cringe a little bit when I hear that word. And it's true, Andy, I do, because, so often when we talk about leadership, it's all about pushing our way to the front, right? And less about where we might be leading or what motivation that may be. And I would just submit to you that there's greater accountability with leadership. I mean, Paul's pretty clear about that in multiple places in the New Testament. And if people are going to be following us, we've got to make sure that they're actually going in the right direction. And I would just submit to you that the only way I think you can pull this off is if actually your intention is not primarily to lead, but it's to follow hard after him. And I use an illustration in the book that where your eyes are set or where your focus is going to determine whether or not, you and anybody who is following you is headed in the right direction. If your eyes are set on him, if your eyes are set on the famous one, then anyone who happens to sort of naturally gravitate to you is ultimately going to be following him. But if my eyes are on the crowd, right, like Pilate's were, on what their reaction is going to be, I'm going to make decisions based on how they will react. And that is going to take not only me, but all of them further away from Jesus, further away from the one that we're trying to follow. So I just think there needs to be a sort of a fundamental shift. Instead of a pursuit of leadership, I think we need to be in pursuit of following hard after him. It may naturally result in some leadership, but I just don't think that should ever be the primary goal.
Mm. So in the chapter talking about the awe factor, I thought this was a really interesting concept. I'd love you to unpack a little bit more. You say that God is beyond big and less than small.
Yeah, beyond big, less than small, and actually incomprehensibly unknowable as well. And it's this concept that I don't know that I've fully wrapped my brain around, but a God that is big enough to create a world so expansive that you and I don't know the limits of it, yet intentional enough to reduce himself to humanity to save me. And yet the complexity of him is something that we will never fully wrap our mind around. And yet, Andy, a relationship with that being, a being that complex, that huge, yet stooping to our level, and yet so complex that we can't know him, a relationship with that being is at the center of what he desires. And it's just, if that doesn't excite you about being a part of that story, then I just don't think that anything will. And so I think actually this is at the center of what I hope people would take away from this book, is that, God could have done this a lot of different ways. And when he got tired of Moses's excuses, my excuses, he could just be done with this. But he doesn't do that, Andy, because his deepest desire is to interact with the pinnacle of his creation. And so as we deal with this juxtaposition, I guess, between these two competing ideas of fame, I hope that we don't throw them both out together. I hope that we will sort of reorient ourselves to living a life that is in pursuit of fame, but it's not our own fame. It's the one that we can gather and then take to interact with the tangible world in very tangible ways.
You talk about in the chapter, I don't know that, we all have this fear of the unknown. Mm-hmm. And the first step is to simply say, I don't know. That is powerful and scary. Why is that?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, I'll be real vulnerable here for a minute. To this day, my parents and my siblings give me a little bit of a hard time, because this is something that I was virtually incapable of doing growing up. And I probably still have a pretty hard aversion to it. I just don't want to admit that I don't have the answers. And Andy, I think the reason for that is because if I admit I don't have the answers, then I don't have control over the outcome, right? Because I can't manage it. And yet when you're talking about a relationship with God, I mean, if we desire to know parts of him and facets of him that we don't currently know, we have to admit that. And we have to be willing to go into areas that he hasn't revealed to us yet. And I don't know, I've just come to a place in my life where I'm blessed beyond measure with the parts of God that I do know. But Andy, I'm desperate to know the far side of him. I'm desperate to know the side of him that's not yet been revealed to me. And so I'm trying to get better at this idea of admitting I don't know and asking God to reveal more of himself to me. And, as I take little baby strides in this direction and maybe learn a little bit more, the thing that I'm finding, Andy, is that it opens up relationships. It allows other people to share their vulnerabilities with me and allows each of us to sort of learn from each other and in the process learn more about God. So I'm not there yet. And in fact, when I write, I find that this is true a lot. I often don't maybe write from a place of expertise. I kind of write from my current station in life, what I'm currently struggling with or working through, and this would be one of them. But it's definitely something that I desire to grow in it as we go along.
So a little later on, you talk about in the chapter, remember to understand. I thought this was interesting. I underlined it because this is how I feel a lot too. Why are we so frequently hesitant to draw near to God or run to him with our challenges? Why do you think that is? And how do we, I don't know, get over that? Yeah.
Yeah. This might surprise you a little bit. I think a lot of it, at least for me, let me answer it from my perspective. Maybe this isn't true for everyone, but from my perspective, yeah, I'm a little bit fearful. It's easy for me to say that I want God's power in my life, but Andy, for those who don't know or it's new to them, it causes them to pull away, and it causes me to appear peculiar, right? And maybe that shouldn't scare me so much because the Bible actually tells us that we will be peculiar if we follow Jesus. But that's a big deterrent for me, or at least it has been over my life, to running to him with problems, because it will stand out from the world. But I guess I'm just coming to a place where I'm desperate enough for this mighty move of God that he promised to Habakkuk. I'm desperate for it to appear in our time. And I'm absolutely convinced that if I operate out of that fear as opposed to an exhilaration that God is going to move, then we're going to get more of the same, Andy. This frustration with the culture that at least I have, we're going to get more of it. And I don't want that. I want the presence of God to show up in a real way. So my endeavor is to get over that fear, to draw near to him, and to embrace that power anyway, and to ask that power to make a real difference in these problems that I see around us.
So this was a deep question. I'm still kind of noodling around a little bit in your chapter, Invest in the Old Man. Talk a little bit about, you're thinking eternal perspective in this chapter and what our life, I don't know if you felt that way when you were writing this, or maybe this has just been in your mind for a while, but talk a little bit about investing in the old man or old woman.
So I just think so often I've had the inclination to think about the next 5 minutes, right? Think about what is going to prosper me now, what is going to be good for my family in the near term. And I've needed a shift, Andy, to what is going to glorify his name in the long run. And sort of the easiest way for me to accomplish this has been to try to mentally fast forward my life to what it will look like when I'm either on my deathbed or maybe, just in my more senior years. What am I going to have been? What will I be glad that I spent time doing, and what will I be frustrated that I wasted a bunch of time on? And honestly, I think it really comes back to this same fundamental question we talked about. Am I spending time pursuing my own fame and my own accolades, or am I spending time channeling and acquiring and spreading to the world around me the fame of the Eternal One, the fame of the Creator? And honestly, I think the extent to which I do the latter more will be the extent to which I am at peace with how I have lived my life when I am an old man. So I guess just mentally putting myself in that place of being the one looking back on my life and then trying to adjust in the real time while I'm here. I don't want to wait till the end, Andy, to do that analysis, right? I want to try to do it now while I can still do something to change it.
All right. So you talk about in the chapter, embrace the power, that a lot of us claim to believe the power of God can overcome any obstacle. But how do we actually embrace that?
The best way to do this is try to be extremely practical and extremely tangible with this. And, I have long professed that I want the power of God to show up in my life, but I've been hesitant to be the one that calls it forth, frankly, because I'm afraid that he's not going to show up. And so the way I'm trying to think about this now, Andy, and the challenge that I make in the book is I want us to think about us as being the connective tissue of God's fame and God's power. We believe that he's capable of creating, of performing all sorts of powerful acts. And I mean, I'm including outright miracles, healings, showing up in people's lives to save them from addiction. I mean, I think that power is very real and God can perform it in our lives, but he chooses to do it through us. So in the book, Andy, I go through a whole list of commands that we know that we are supposed to embody. Love your neighbor, confront injustice, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, befriend the lonely, comfort the ailing, clothe the naked, visit the prisoner. On down the line you go. But none of those things happen, Andy, until we step into that, right? So we want God's power to confront injustice. Well, that doesn't happen until we confront the injustice. We want God to address the hungry and to the thirsty. Well, that doesn't happen until I carry food and water to the hungry and thirsty. We want God to comfort and visit the prisoner. That doesn't happen until I actually step foot into the prison and visit the prisoner. So when it comes to embracing the power of God, it's just a challenge for me to realize that isn't just something that I call out from God. That is something that I ask God to do, yes, but I ask him to do it through me. I ask him to show me how I am supposed to walk out these commandments. And so it's just an encouragement for all of us to intertwine those things more, because quite frankly, that's the way he designed it too. He didn't set this world on autopilot. He also didn't turn it all over to us. It's a both and thing. It's to call his power into our world in tangible ways, but it's to realize that we are a part of that as well.
All right, one last question, because I thought this was a really cool analogy in your chapter about mercy advocates. You talk about that you're not supposed to carry your rocks and don't let others carry your rocks too. What does that mean?
Yeah, okay, so this involves a story about my youngest daughter, Hope. We were visiting Chicago, which I consider my hometown. I grew up in farm country in Illinois. But basically, I carried a backpack around all day with all my kids' stuff in it. And when we got back to the hotel, I discovered that someone had stashed 2 large chunks of concrete into the backpack. And when I questioned the kids about it, my youngest, Hope, she said, well, those are my special rocks, Dad. And I didn't want to leave them at the hotel. So I had toted these 2 chunks of concrete around Chicago all day, needlessly carrying weight. But Andy, what it said to me is, I think there are 2 kinds of weight that we needlessly carry around in our lives. And the first is the weight of sin. And I think for a long time, have really not given credence to the full price that Jesus paid on the cross, because I was still carrying around the guilt of my sin, even though Jesus had already paid it on the cross. And so I need to take that weight out of my life. I don't have to carry it anymore. But second, Andy, is the weight of unforgiveness. Other people have wronged us and don't deserve our forgiveness as well. But if we want the forgiveness that was provided for us on the cross, we have to be able to pass that forgiveness on to others as well. So I think those are 2 weights that I really have carried around in my life. And if we want to be fully effective for amplifying the fame of God in our time, I think we've got to live unencumbered. And I think we've got to be willing to lay down the guilt of our sin that he's paid the price for. And we've also got to be able to forgive others when they wrong us. Taking a look at the Bible, picking up in Deuteronomy 27, starting at verse 1. Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, keep all these commands that I give you today. When you have crossed the Jordan into the land the Lord your God is giving you, set up some large stones and coat them with plaster. Write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. And when you have crossed the Jordan, set up these stones on Mount Ebal, as I command you today, and coat them with plaster. Build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool on them. Build the altar of the Lord your God with field stones and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. Sacrifice fellowship offerings there,
eating them and rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. And you shall write very clearly all the words of this law on these stones you have set up. If you've been following along with the Bible stories we've been talking about, just looking at the Israelites' journey to this point, God would do something, they'd be forgetful and forget that God was in control, and then God would have to do something again and say, have you not forgotten? And so finally he gets to this point where he says, all right, you're going to go to this new promised land. I've prepared a way for you, and I've given you some rules to live by. But in order for you not to forget them, put up a whole bunch of rocks, write on the rocks the rules that you're supposed to follow. And how often do I forget to do this in my life? That I get distracted with everything in the world when something comes at me that I'm not ready for, I don't know what to do. You know, the basics of what we're supposed to do, our life, it's in the Bible. And maybe we have to come up with a modern day way to put those words, God's truth, in our life all over where we see them. It could be a pile of rocks. I think that still works. But putting it on our walls, in our car, in our office, on our hearts, the more we have the reminders of what God has done and what he promises to do, the more we'll remember them. And it will keep us from worrying or going the wrong direction. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Daniel Jones, who thought it would be a simple 2-hour drive, a quick trip from South Carolina to Johnson City, Tennessee to give away his daughter at her wedding. But as fate would have it, his journey would be anything but simple. Hurricane Helene had left a wake of devastation in the area, with floodwaters cutting off roads and bridges, making travel nearly impossible. And as David approached the Tennessee state line, his path was blocked, and the state troopers told him all routes were washed out. There's no way through. But David wasn't about to let anything, certainly not a hurricane, keep him from one of the most important moments of his life. So he did what any devoted father would do. He decided to walk. With nothing but a flashlight on his phone and a reflector pole for safety, David set off through nearly 30 miles of debris and mud, driven by one thought alone. My daughter's getting married at 11, and I'm going to be there to walk her down the aisle. And so David walked through the night, constantly checking his watch and his phone battery, realizing he had no idea how he was going to get there on time at the pace he was going, but God would provide a way. And wouldn't you know it, as he gets past the big roadblock and he's up in the mountains, an old friend recognized him and brought him the rest of the way. So even though the wedding had to go on by candlelight, David was there, right beside his daughter. And so because David stopped at nothing to let his daughter know one last time that she would always be his princess, he is officially entering the Manly with Andy Hall of Heroes. It engulfs 2/3 of church-going men. And Sam Black has written a book on how the church can help those trapped in compulsive behaviors with pornography. God's people marked a miracle in a powerful way. And Johnny Davies has a need for speed, and the record he just broke is dragging him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up next week on Manly with Andy. Manly with Andy is a Wow God production. Discover more at wowgod.com.